Hey guys, and welcome to this episode of Behind the Frame. This is a series where myself and the rest of the Wild Eye team take an image that we've captured on Safari, share some of the moments behind the image, and then show you how we go about editing it in Lightroom. This week, I'm going to be looking at an image of a male leopard captured at the Lentorre Hide in Kenya's South Rift Valley. I hope you'll enjoy it. Right, so it's always great seeing animals at a waterhole. It's even better when you're in a hide. And what's better than that? Well, being at eye level. And the hide at Lentorre Lodge is absolutely incredible. It has been set up for photography in terms of the lighting. It's just incredible. Beds to overnight in the hide. There's a reflective glass panel that you shoot through so the animals don't hear you at all. And given how wild and remote this area is, it's incredible to see these animals approach the hide and for you to be able to move around and shoot without impacting on their behavior whatsoever. We experienced some incredible opportunities there during our visit last year, seeing things like caracal, African wildcat, striped hyena, porcupines every night. But the highlight, I think, was this particular leopard that came down to drink on a couple of occasions, in fact. So that's why I've chosen to edit this image for us today. And I'm going to share the shot with you as a raw file and show you, just run you through my thought process on how I would go about editing it. And then we can have a look at where we end up as a finished product. So let's get into it. Here is the absolute raw file. Let me reset there. And you can see there's a little bit of color coming through from the lighting, the warm tungsten lights. Now, this has already been shot, and this is something that we're able to do. And the first thing I do when I get into the hide is set a custom white balance for a value that is as close as possible to what we need in order to get the true reflection of the color of light. So whenever you shoot under a spotlight, a really good idea to actually check the color temperature of that particular spotlight. Some spotlights are a little bit warmer than others, and so you're able to, using a custom Kelvin value in your white balance, adjust to what is accurate in terms of reflecting whites of your subject and of the scene as white rather than having a warm cast. So just looking at the EXIF info of this shot, taken at ISO 6400, 200 millimeters, f2.8 at 160th of a second. And the important one here is the color temperature of 3000. Now, 5200 is daylight. So you can see that these lights, if I take that color temperature up here, these lights are very warm and very orange, and so a custom white balance of 3000 Kelvin made a huge difference. The point where I'm going to start is if you have a look at this image. Let's have a look here. So there we go, right. If we have a look at the kind of color cast of this, you can still see that there's a little bit of a warm tint to it. So what I'm going to be doing is using this tint slider to add a little bit more magenta into the image. I'm slowly going to adjust here till I get to a more accurate color. So somewhere around about there. It's a subtle adjustment, but have a look at the difference that this makes. Coming from there, and if I just reset that, you can see the difference that that makes to this color cast. And so when we come through and we have a look at the overall image, we find that already we're in a much better position. Now, when I'm working these images and editing, it's always about dialing up parts of the frame that you want your viewer to look at and dial down areas that you don't want the viewer to look at. Now, in this instance, because we've got a spotlight, it's actually a lot easier. Only the brightest parts of the frame are rendered in the frame, and because we've shot at this particular shutter speed, shooting in full manual, we've kept the darks and the shadows nice and dark and shadowy, which helps our story quite a bit. But when we're editing, there's still a little bit of work to be done here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just tease out a little bit of the whites, just to make the leopard pop just that little bit more. I'm going to drop the blacks a touch. And the reason for that is I really want these dark areas to be nice and pitch black. By standard on the Canon system, I like to increase my saturation by a value of around about 4. So I'm going to dial that in. And then very important, because this was shot at a relatively high ISO, coming down to this detail panel here. Remember, masking, using the Alt key or the Option key on your Mac, we can now mask out. Now, as I'm going through this, anything that is white reflects an edge, and that shows an area that's going to be sharpened. Now, in this foreground here, there is nothing to be sharpened. So I want to mask out to a point where only the most prominent features and edges of my subject are going to be sharpened. And that's probably where I want to play. From an amount perspective, I'm going to dial that up slightly. And looking at this 100% preview here, if I pop that on the eye and I have a look at before, look at you probably won't pick this up on the screen, but there is an improvement, a dramatic improvement on the clarity of this area when I've been able to mask out and apply the sharpening to only the most prominent edges there. On a whole, I'm going to increase noise reduction just by a value of 10. Now, why I don't want to go beyond that is that noise reduction here is applied across the frame. And if you're aggressive with that noise reduction, you end up having a very pastel-like look to the image with a lot of detail in the face would be lost. We do have an option which Lightroom has made a lot easier to us. If I just close that panel, and we've now got these basic masks and special adjustments. We can very quickly grab our subject, and you'll see how Lightroom has now masked out the areas that we want. You see, it has included the edge of the water hole here, which I don't quite want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my mask adjustment. I'm going to subtract that area from the mask using a brush. I'm going to change the size of my brush using the square brackets, and then I'm going to change the flow. So the flow and density here. Flow is, if you think about a spray can, if your density is set to 100, you're going to be looking at 100% of the effect. And if your flow is set to 40, at each brush stroke will apply 40% of that. So think about a spray can. As you spray, you build up the amount of paint that's going to be applied to an area, and it's very similar with the brush. So by using a flow of 30 here and just hitting numerical key 3 jumps between those increments on this brush, I can slowly start to erase this effect from here. And because it's far away from the subject, I can go up to 100, and with a single brush stroke I can take away the full effect, and then as I get closer to the edges I drop it back down to 30, reduce the flow and reduce the size, and so I'm only really left with my subject and the reflection, which I'm happy with. So there's my mask. What I want to do now is duplicate and invert this mask so that I'm working outside of the subject. And again, Lightroom has done a really great job. I'm going to subtract from this mask a little bit using a brush, and keeping the flow down, I'm going to just take away the hard edge that's been built in around that section over there. So now we are working outside of our subject, and all I'm going to do here is apply a little bit of noise reduction, and I am going to drop the highlights just a little bit. You see how we can then dial down the edges of the water hole just to make them a little less prominent in the frame. Now by doing that, you'll see that this edge here has still got a little bit of bright area to it, so I'm going to add a little bit of a brush. I'm going to come in and expand on this brush here, and it's really just this area here, and you can see that slowly just building up the effect, and I don't want to leave any hard edges, so I'm just going outside of the lines a little bit. And our goal here is to bring this edge into the same sort of exposure value as this part here. So minor adjustments on the exposure side of things, and let's have a look at that. We pull back, and I'm going to now switch off all of the special adjustments on these masks, and you can see what we've been able to do, dialing that area down so that our subject just becomes a little bit more prominent in the frame. So what are we going to do right at the end here? 2 little adjustments. The first one is straightening. It seems a little bit off, and I'm going to use the straightening tool, this little spirit level that they've got next to the angle. You can swing this left and right as well, but by grabbing this tool I can now go and say, right, but between those 2 pupils of the eyes, that's what I believe and deem as straight, and Lightroom has now done that for us. Finally, a little bit of contrast, and again, I always say, if you feel that your images are lacking a little something, if there's just that little something that's missing, you'll probably find that by adding a little bit of contrast in the tone curve, that your image will just come to life. So let's have a look at what that looks like here. If we take the lights slider and just dial that up just by a value of 10 and drop the shadows slightly, all this is doing is it is taking, instead of contrast on a global scale and making brights brighter and darks darker, we are now using the tone curve to work on a particular tonal range within the histogram. So when we're adjusting the lights, we're taking the brightest lights and making them brighter, and the darkest lights and making them a little bit darker. So we're getting contrast within a tonal range rather than across the image. So think of it as a more finite, a little bit more detailed adjustment. Rather than going in with a big sledgehammer, we're going in and tinkering at a slightly different level and scale. So there's our full image. If I go back and reset all the way back to the original adjustment, that's what we had coming in, and this is where we have left off. And as an overall view, let's just take this to about 50% here so we can see a little bit more of the detail that we're working with. You can see we've got nice sharp details in the subject. We've got nice clean, noise-free surroundings that we achieved with our mask and the inverted and duplicated subject mask. And I suppose if you really wanted to, the final thing that we could do is the mask that we had on our subject and on the reflection is to maybe just increase the clarity just a little bit more on that area. So there's our final image, and we'll put that adjustment away, and you can see the difference and the final edit just on the end there. So hopefully what this will show you is that when you're shooting from a low-level hide and you've got the aid of a spotlight, whether you're on a vehicle or in a hide for that matter, because you have the spotlight, you're already able to deal with distracting elements in the foreground and the background because the light is falling on your subject. Something we don't have the privilege of when we're photographing during the day. Custom white balance is essential when shooting under the aid of a spotlight, and will help you to get your raw images a lot closer to where they need to be in the finished product. And finally, it doesn't really take a hell of a lot to get a really striking and impressive image when you've shot the scene correctly. This was really a memorable sighting and experience for myself as well as the guests, and I hope that you've enjoyed and that you've learned a little something from this week's edit on the Behind the Frame series.